Good evening, my audience. Today we'll have another talk about the brain gyri and sulci anatomy. In this talk, we'll try to have definitions of what is a gyrus and what is a sulcus and what the sulcus differs from the fissure. This diagram illustrates the gyrus and sulcus morphology. The brain cortex has folded surface with apparent grooves and ridges. The groove or the furrow is called the sulcus, and the ridge or bump is called the gyrus. And you can clearly see this is the demonstration of the brain cortex. This is what we mean by the gyrus. It is the elevated part of the brain cortex or parenchyma. And the depressed areas between the elevated portions is called the sulci. What is the advantage of this? It clearly increases the surface area of the brain by at least 3 folds, which means increase the function of the brain by 3 folds. And this is actually the difference between brain human and the other mammals like animal brain. Let's go to differentiate the sulcus from the fissure. The sulci are shallow depressions or grooves which serves to separate brain lobes from each other. And when the sulcus is significantly deep or deeper in depth, it is called fissure. And the fissure, to differentiate it from the sulcus, it also contains CSF contents and also contains the major, or let's say vascular structure inside. And the sulcus is much superficial and might either contain a small vessel or without a vessel. Now we'll start with the major and important sulci. The first one is the median longitudinal fissure. Why we call it a fissure? Because it extends deeply from the cerebral cortex down in the brain. This structure, which is called the longitudinal fissure, contains the superior sagittal sinus in the superior margin of the falx cerebri, which is the dura that is present along the longitudinal fissure, which is a major midline dural invagination. That longitudinal fissure separates the brain into 2 hemispheres as shown in the slide, the right and left cerebral hemispheres. In the same time, the inferior sagittal sinus lies in the free inferior edge of the falx cerebri, which is related to the longitudinal fissure. In the superior part is the superior sagittal sinus, runs from anterior to posterior. That's why, by the way, we can see that the sagittal sinuses are slightly narrower anteriorly and getting wider posteriorly. This is the direction of venous flow in the brain. Always it comes from anterior to posterior. The next important sulcus is the lateral sulcus, which is also named the Sylvian fissure. The Sylvian fissure serves to separate, as we see in the diaphragm, the frontal lobe and parietal lobe from the temporal lobe. The frontal lobe, if you all notice with me, is totally separated from the temporal lobe by the longitudinal insular or Sylvian fissure. Posteriorly, part of the fissure extends to separate the parietal lobe from the temporal lobe, but the more posterior aspect, both the temporal lobe and parietal lobe attached to each other with no clear separation. As we mentioned that when we call it as a fissure, it has to have a CSF wider space and as a vessel. The insular fissure contains, as we all know, the M2 segment of the middle cerebral artery on each side. And the insular tissue or insular lobe is surrounding the insular fissure along its anterior and posterior boundaries, which we call it the fifth cerebral lobe, the insula. The third one is the central sulcus. Before that, we discussed the parieto-occipital sulcus. Parieto-occipital sulcus is posterior sulcus that separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. So again, we have the central lateral sulcus separates the frontal and parietal from the temporal, and the parieto-occipital sulcus separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. It runs in the medial aspect of the occipital lobe and communicates with the calcarine sulcus in upper anterior part. The central sulcus is a major sulcus in the cerebral cortex. Why it is important? Because it separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, and particularly the importance lies in the separation of the motor cortex from the sensory cortex. And this is what most of the surgeons, when are dealing with tumors or severe brain space occupying lesions, ask about the definition of the central sulcus to guide them to preserve motor fibers and not to produce severe irreversible damage. The central sulcus is very important to identify on CT scan and MRI, since it separates these two very important spaces in the brain. This is again the demarcation of the central sulcus. It goes from the superficial part to the deep part of the brain. Now we have the calcarine sulcus and collateral sulcus. Calcarine sulcus is also in the medial aspect of the brain. It separates the occipital lobe into upper and lower parts of visual cortex. It demarcates the visual cortex and separates it into upper and lower parts. And the collateral sulcus is mainly in the temporal lobe. It separates the medial parahippocampal gyrus from the lateral temporal gyrus and extends posteriorly into the inferior medial aspect of the temporal occipital lobe. The gyri, as we mentioned, are the elevations of the brain, and we have at least the most important gyri in the cerebral cortex, the precentral gyrus in the frontal lobe, which is responsible for the motor and called primary motor area, and posteriorly we have the post-central gyrus, which is the sensory motor gyrus and is separated by the central sulcus, as we mentioned before. I'll give you a clue how to recognize the central sulcus in the axial brain images. It is the sulcus that is continuous from the peripheral to the medial aspects. When you see a sulcus that is continuous from the peripheral to the inner medial aspect falx region, this is 100% almost the central sulcus. So look for this sign to identify the central sulcus. Thank you for listening and hopeful to see you in another radiological talk.